A cool, metallic chill pressed against her skin as she stirred, eyes heavy with exhaustion and a faint throbbing ache where her captors had bound her wrists. She shifted, blinking away the hazy remnants of sedation. The stale air and low hum of the vessel's engines confirmed her location, still trapped in this forsaken, drifting ship, with no allies, no hope, and dwindling time. The princess's slender fingers grazed her neck, searching for the familiar weight of her communication amulet. It was gone. She grimaced. Of course, they'd stripped her of anything useful. No one would come. Her captors made that clear when they left her, merely a bargaining chip, in this prison. Her mind flooded with the image of her family, the council, the rigid laws of their realm, all those who had promised her safety yet failed her, abandoning her to this end. For a brief moment she cursed herself. She should have seen the betrayal coming, the warning signs had been there. But in the cocoon of royal privilege, she'd assumed loyalty was guaranteed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a muffled sound, like metal clanking against metal, somewhere in the corridor beyond her cell. She tensed, holding her breath, every sense on edge. The ship was supposed to be deserted, drifting in enemy territory with no one on board except her. But someone, or something, was moving. She'd heard the humans had recently ventured into this sector. Crude, aggressive, and primitive was what her instructors had always called them, no better than warmongering creatures from a bygone age. They were a threat, a nuisance, and utterly beneath the attention of her people. She'd been taught that they were insatiable, relentless, quick to fight yet slow to understand. It would be one more misfortune to add to her list if a human ship had somehow stumbled upon this wreck. No doubt they'd see her as a trophy, nothing more than a pawn to add leverage in their negotiations. The clanking grew louder, each metallic clang a note in the strange symphony of her growing fear. She strained her ears, focusing on the rhythm, the pattern. This wasn't the erratic movement of some rogue machine but the deliberate footfalls of someone, or something, getting closer. The door slid open, scraping against the warped frame, and a figure stepped through. She squinted, barely able to make out the shape in the dim light. It was a human male, tall and rough around the edges. He wore a simple spacesuit, marred with patches and a few scratches. He looked as if he'd been through battles and somehow emerged victorious. His eyes, piercing and assessing, locked onto her immediately. For a long moment, neither of them moved. She felt a mix of anger and fear at her own helplessness. She despised the position she was in, a captive to fate, and now seemingly at the mercy of a species she had barely considered worth her time. But the human didn't make any moves to threaten her. Instead, he just stared, his gaze softening as he took in her bruised wrists and disheveled appearance. "You look worse than I expected," he muttered, his voice carrying a rough, almost disarming tone. Without waiting for her response, he knelt beside her, pulling a small medical kit from his side. She recoiled instinctively, pressing herself against the wall. But he raised his hands, palms out, a universal sign of peace that momentarily confused her. "Look," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I'm not here to hurt you. Just need to make sure you're not dying on my watch." The words caught her off guard. Dying on his watch? What kind of nonsense was that? If he was human, he should have had no reason to care. She'd expected cruelty or at least indifference. But here he was, offering her help. With a bitter taste in her mouth, she let him check her pulse, his touch surprisingly careful. He worked in silence, cleaning and bandaging a wound on her arm. She found herself studying his face, watching as his brows furrowed in concentration. He didn't look at her with contempt or even curiosity. His expression was one she hadn't expected. It was concern, genuine concern. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice coming out weaker than intended. "Just a pilot. Came across this ship, thought I'd investigate. Didn't expect, well, any of this." He looked her over one more time, clearly assessing the damage. "How did you end up here?" She hesitated. How could she explain the betrayal, the abandonment, the politics that had left her adrift and hopeless? And why would he care? He was a stranger, and a human at that. "Let's just say my own people saw fit to leave me here," she replied, her tone colder than she felt. He nodded, as if he understood perfectly. Sounds like your own kind did you dirty. It happens. I've been there. She blinked in surprise. Look, I don't know who left you here or why, but you're not alone anymore. I can't just leave you here to rot. She found herself almost laughing at the absurdity of it all. You'd risk yourself for someone you don't even know? Sure, he replied with a shrug. That's kind of what we humans do. Guess it doesn't make sense to most, but we don't leave people behind. Besides, he paused, looking her dead in the eyes. Doesn't feel right, leaving someone stranded when I could help. For the first time since her capture, she felt a flicker of warmth inside her. It was an unfamiliar feeling, almost uncomfortable. Her society prized efficiency, strength, the ability to survive and lead without weakness. Empathy, especially for an unknown alien, was hardly a valued trait. But here he was, acting against his own interests, for no apparent gain. Thank you, she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He seemed taken aback, his lips twitching in an almost smile. Don't mention it. Now let's get out of here. I've got a ship nearby, and we better move fast. This sector isn't exactly friendly. She watched as he turned his back to her, gesturing for her to follow him. In her world, trust was a currency rarely given and often betrayed. But as she stood up, still unsteady, she found herself wanting to follow him, even if just for a little while. She followed the human through dimly lit corridors, each step a struggle against the aches and bruises that marked her body. The ship groaned and creaked, and she could feel its instability with every footfall. Yet, somehow, she found herself focusing on the figure leading her. His pace was quick, but he adjusted it to match her own without a word. She wasn't sure if this consideration annoyed or intrigued her. He led her into a larger compartment, where he paused to rummage through a survival pack, pulling out a small packet of nutrient paste and a canteen of water. He passed them to her without ceremony, then turned to scan the room, seemingly unfazed by her hesitant stare. She looked down at the food in her hands, and for a moment, the act felt surreal. Her own people had abandoned her, yet this human, who owed her nothing, was feeding her. She resisted the urge to analyze it too deeply. So you're a princess, huh? He asked, more as an observation than a question, while he checked the contents of his kit. His tone was neither mocking nor reverent, merely curious, as though he were discussing the weather. Yes, she replied, taking a sip of water to wash down the metallic taste of the nutrient paste. Though I'm not sure what that title means out here, abandoned and forgotten. He shrugged. Titles don't mean much to me. It's what people do that matters. Where I'm from, a title won't keep you warm at night or keep you fed. He met her gaze, and there was a depth there she hadn't expected. She'd always been taught that humans were brutish and unrefined, incapable of understanding the complexities of her people's society. Yet, as she looked at him, his unassuming demeanor, the casual ease with which he spoke about things her own people would have considered taboo, she felt a crack in her certainty. Your kind sees the world simply, she said, trying to understand this strange generosity. You don't seem to overthink things, do you? He chuckled, a rough, warm sound that seemed to echo off the metal walls. We think plenty, but maybe we don't waste time complicating things that don't need to be complicated. You needed help. I'm here. Simple. Simple. That was the word. And yet it was anything but. This simplicity seemed rooted in something she couldn't quite define, a sense of duty, perhaps, or loyalty, though not one born of obligation. It was genuine, an impulse rather than a choice. Her own people wouldn't understand it. They would call it reckless, perhaps foolish. But she was starting to see it as something else. They fell silent as he continued his task, occasionally glancing in her direction as though gauging her condition. She couldn't deny that his attention was comforting, in an unsettling way. The more she tried to distance herself emotionally, the more his presence seemed to erode her defenses. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to doubt the convictions she'd been taught. Finally, he glanced at her, a question lingering in his eyes. Why did they leave you here? She swallowed, feeling the familiar surge of anger mixed with shame. I misjudged who I could trust. The politics of my people are complicated. My family has power, influence, but that comes with enemies, even from within. I didn't expect that they would leave me. Her voice grew quiet, the admission feeling raw and too vulnerable. He studied her for a moment, and she braced for the pity she thought would follow. But there was none. Instead, he nodded, as though he'd seen enough of the world to understand without needing details. Happens to the best of us. People are people, even when they're not. It was such a simple, unpretentious thing to say, but it cut deeper than she expected. She realized he wasn't comparing her to her people but drawing on something universal. She didn't need to be of his species to understand the bitterness of betrayal. We're not so different, he continued, the slightest edge in his voice. You think we're brutal or simple, don't you? Maybe we are. But humans, we survive. We have each other's backs, even when the odds are against us. That's how we've made it this far. He paused, his gaze steady on her, unflinching. You're in a tight spot, and so am I. So I figure we'll get through it together. She hadn't expected him to be so open. His words were like a mirror, reflecting back the very things she'd dismissed as weaknesses in his kind. She nodded slowly, feeling a strange sense of kinship she couldn't quite place. Together, then, she murmured, almost to herself. He nodded once, accepting her words as easily as he'd offered his own. But he didn't linger on the sentiment. Instead, he handed her a worn thermal blanket, gesturing for her to sit. Rest up. We've got some distance to cover, and you look like you could use it. Reluctantly, she sat, wrapping the blanket around herself. He returned to his pack, rifling through it as though organizing supplies. She watched him, intrigued by how at ease he seemed in such a hostile environment, as if danger were simply a part of his daily life. It was as though he had a constant readiness for things to go wrong, and she found herself wondering what kind of life he must have lived to become this way. After a moment, she cleared her throat. Where I'm from, duty is everything. It's expected of us to do what's right, but only for our own. He looked up, a small spark of curiosity in his eyes. And that doesn't include others even when they need help? Her lips tightened. Help, as you call it, is something we offer only to those we trust. For us, loyalty is selective. He grunted, shaking his head. We're different then. To us, loyalty means something even if you don't know the person. You'd think it would make us weak, but it's made us stronger. Keeps us fighting, even when everything else tells us to give up. The words settled in her mind, each one challenging everything she'd believed. She felt a strange mix of envy and unease. For her, survival had always been calculated, efficient, devoid of the sentiment that seemed to drive him. She'd been raised to look down on such things, but now, as she sat beside him, she wondered if perhaps her people's beliefs were lacking something vital. The silence grew heavier, and as much as she wanted to dismiss his words, she couldn't shake the feeling that they held an undeniable truth. Finally, he broke the quiet with a quiet murmur, almost as if speaking to himself. Out here, doesn't matter where you're from or what you are. You make it by sticking together. Nothing else matters. There was a quiet conviction in his tone that struck her. In a world where her people placed value on strength, power, and isolation, this human's belief in connection and solidarity seemed both foreign and comforting. She could see it in his every action, in the way he'd chosen to stay and help her, risking himself without knowing her worth or her past. It was loyalty born not of duty but of something deeper. For the first time, she felt a subtle but unmistakable shift inside. She wasn't sure if it was respect or something else, but it was enough to make her see him, and perhaps all of humanity, in a new light. They moved together in silence, navigating the ship's tight corridors, each step echoing faintly against the metallic walls. She noticed how he scanned every shadow, each flicker of dim light. His movements were calculated, instinctual, as if he'd been through this exact scenario 100 times. She mirrored his movements, watching his every step, learning from him in ways she hadn't anticipated. Their path took them through a section filled with debris, remnants of old battles or structural failures that now served as hazards. A metal beam had fallen across their path, blocking the way forward. Without hesitation, he crouched, inspecting it, then turned to her with a faint nod, indicating she should help lift it. She braced herself, gripping the cold metal alongside him, and they heaved it aside, their combined strength clearing the path. It was a simple act, but something about their unspoken coordination felt right. They'd barely moved forward when a sharp, piercing alarm blared, sending vibrations through the floor beneath them. She stiffened, her pulse quickening as she glanced at him for guidance. His expression remained calm, even as he reached for his weapon, scanning their surroundings. There was no panic, only an increased focus, and she found herself steadied by his reaction, her own fear tempered by his calm. "What does that mean?" she whispered, trying to match his tone. "Security system triggered," he muttered. "Probably picked up on our movement. We have to move quickly or else." He didn't finish, but he didn't have to. She understood well enough. Whatever security measures this ship had left wouldn't care that she was a prisoner or that he was her rescuer. To the system, they were both intruders, and it would deal with them as such. He signaled her forward, and they began a swift, tense march down a side corridor, their movements quick but controlled. They reached a section where the floor sloped downward, the metal beneath their feet slick with what looked like residue from leaking pipes. She slipped, her feet giving way beneath her, but he caught her arm before she hit the ground, steadying her with a firm grip. She was about to thank him when she caught the faintest hint of a smile on his face, a tiny spark of amusement, as if her near fall had been some light-hearted moment in the middle of this chaos. Despite herself, she felt a hint of warmth rise in her cheeks. Here they were, surrounded by potential threats, and he still found time for humor. She found herself strangely grateful, realizing that his resilience wasn't just physical but something deeper, a kind of resilience of spirit that she'd never encountered before. It was something she envied, even if she wasn't ready to admit it to him or herself. They rounded a corner and stopped, frozen at the sight of two automated drones hovering in the corridor ahead. They were armed, their sleek metallic bodies glinting in the dim light, sensors glowing as they scanned their surroundings. She held her breath, waiting for him to make the first move. He assessed the situation, his eyes narrowing as he took in the layout, calculating their odds. Slowly, he leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "We're gonna have to disable them if we're going to get through. Do you trust me?" Trust. It was such a fragile thing, something her people rarely spoke of in earnest. But in that moment, with danger looming ahead, she realized she did trust him. She nodded, feeling a quiet resolve settle over her. He gave her a quick, approving glance, then gestured for her to stay low as he moved forward, positioning himself at an angle where the drones couldn't easily detect him. With swift, efficient motions, he raised his weapon, firing in rapid bursts that sent sparks flying as the drones jolted, struggling to respond. She watched in awe as he moved, each step purposeful, his focus unwavering. The drones didn't stand a chance. Within moments, they lay in smoking pieces on the floor, and he turned back to her, extending a hand. "Come on," he said, and she took his hand, feeling the warmth of his grip as he helped her over the wreckage. They pressed on, reaching the end of the corridor where a large metal door stood, partially ajar. Beyond it, the faint hum of machinery indicated some kind of control room. He entered first, scanning the area before motioning for her to follow. Inside, rows of control panels blinked with faint lights, screens showing distorted images of various parts of the ship. "Looks like we found the heart of this place," he muttered, moving toward one of the consoles. "If I can get into the system, maybe I can shut down some of the security protocols. Give us a safer route to my ship." As he worked, she found herself watching him again, studying his hands as they moved deftly over the controls. His fingers, calloused and scarred, were a stark contrast to her own, which had known little hardship. She'd spent her life surrounded by luxury and protection, her hands used more for ceremonial gestures than for anything practical. And yet here she was, depending on him, a man who seemed to have survived a life she couldn't imagine. "Why do you do this?" she asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He didn't look up, his focus still on the screen in front of him. Do what? Help others. Risk yourself like this, for someone you don't know, who's not even of your species. He paused, considering her words before he responded. I don't see it that way. Out here, it doesn't matter where you're from or what you look like. You help each other because that's how you survive. We're all just trying to make it through. And if I can help someone along the way, why wouldn't I? She couldn't answer. His words made sense in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. It was so unlike the values of her people, who valued isolation and self-preservation above all else. But something about his philosophy resonated with her, igniting a spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Just then, the console beeped, and he gave a low sigh of relief. Got it. I've shut down the primary security network. We should have a clear path to the exit. They left the control room and retraced their steps, the tension in the air slightly eased with the threat of the security drones neutralized. As they walked, he began talking, recounting tales of his journeys, the battles he'd fought, the people he'd met along the way. She listened intently, captivated by his stories of courage and camaraderie, of the bonds he'd formed with others across vast distances. For her, each word was a revelation, a glimpse into a world so different from her own. His experiences, his resilience, they were foreign to her, but something about them felt right. She found herself wanting to understand more, to see the world through his eyes. When they finally reached the exit, he paused, looking back at her with a faint smile. We're almost there. Just a little further, and you'll be safe. She felt a pang of emotion she couldn't quite name. This human, this stranger, had risked everything to bring her this far. And in doing so, he'd shown her a different way of living, a way that valued connection and kindness over power and isolation. She wasn't sure how to thank him, or if words would even be enough. As they stepped through the final corridor, she glanced at him, a new respect filling her gaze. She realized that this journey hadn't just changed her perspective, it had changed her, deepening her understanding of courage, loyalty, and trust in a way she hadn't known was possible. They reached the outer hatch of the ship, its heavy door sealing them off from the vastness of space beyond. She could see his ship now, docked not far from their position, a small, unassuming vessel compared to the sleek ships her people commanded, yet there was something comforting in its rugged design, a sense of reliability she couldn't ignore. She was almost safe, almost out of this nightmare, and yet the relief that should have come felt strangely absent. He was already working at the controls, his expression focused and determined as he prepared to open the hatch. As she watched, a strange weight settled over her, a thought she couldn't quite shake. This journey had taken her far beyond survival. It had shown her something she hadn't expected to find in this forgotten corner of the universe. She realized with a pang that when they parted, she'd be leaving more behind than she'd brought with her. Suddenly, the low rumble of the ship's security alarm sounded, far louder than before, reverberating through the metal walls with an urgency that sent her heart racing. He looked up sharply, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon, scanning the corridor behind them. She didn't need to ask what it meant, she knew. The ship's main defense systems had reactivated, likely detecting his attempts to override the controls. They were out of time. He turned to her, a fierce determination in his eyes. I'll hold them off. Get to the ship. Don't stop for anything. She froze, a cold dread settling over her as she registered his words. You're coming with me, she said, her voice firm, but he shook his head, already moving back toward the corridor they'd just come from. They'll be here in minutes, he replied, his tone steady. If we both try to make a run for it, we'll never reach the ship in time. You have to go. Now. She stared at him, her mind rebelling against the notion, unable to accept that he was willing to sacrifice himself so easily, so readily. Everything in her training, everything her people had ever taught her, screamed that this was madness. Self-preservation was paramount, survival above all else. And yet here he was, willing to risk his life for hers without a second thought. Why? She demanded, her voice barely a whisper, laced with an emotion she didn't fully understand. "Why would you do this? We've only just met. I'm not even one of your kind." He looked at her then, and in his gaze she saw something she couldn't explain, a mixture of kindness and resolve that went beyond words. "Because you deserve a chance to get out of here," he replied simply. "We all do. Maybe that's something you haven't learned yet, but sometimes people do things just because it's right. Not for a reward. Not for recognition." Her heart hammered as his words sank in, challenging everything she'd ever known. She could feel the walls of her beliefs crumbling, each stone loosened by the raw truth in his voice. And for the first time, she understood what he meant, what it meant to care without expectation, to give without condition. But this knowledge was painful, a sharp reminder that she'd been blind to something profound all her life. She took a step toward him, her hand reaching out involuntarily, but he held up a hand, a small smile on his face that was both reassuring and heartbreaking. "Go," he said, his tone firm yet gentle. "Get to my ship. Take off as soon as you're inside. I'll try to meet you, but if I don't wait for me." A shuddering breath escaped her as she forced herself to nod, her chest tight with a mix of fear and admiration she could barely contain. With one last, lingering look, she turned, forcing herself to run toward his ship, her steps heavy with the knowledge of what she was leaving behind. The hatch opened with a hiss, and she scrambled inside, her mind racing, heart pounding as she strapped herself into the pilot's seat. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, to do something, to fight. But his words held her there, a weight pressing her down, compelling her to honor his wishes. As the engine hummed to life, she gripped the controls, her hands trembling as she waited, hoping against hope that he would appear in the hatchway. Minutes passed, each one an eternity, the sound of the alarms growing fainter as she ascended through the ship's docking tunnel. She scanned the corridor below, searching desperately for any sign of him, for the familiar figure she'd come to trust against all odds. But the hatch remained empty, a cold, silent reminder of the sacrifice he'd chosen to make. Her fingers tightened around the controls, her mind waging a silent war. She was a princess, an heir to a throne that commanded loyalty and respect, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All the power, the influence, the privilege meant nothing in the face of the courage he'd shown her, the gift he'd given her without asking for anything in return. And then, as she prepared to take off, a shadow moved in the corridor below. Her heart leaped, hope flaring as she recognized the familiar figure sprinting toward the hatch, his face etched with determination and relief. She watched, barely daring to breathe, as he threw himself through the hatch just as it began to close, collapsing in the narrow passage beside her, chest heaving, eyes blazing with the fierce spark of survival. She wanted to shout, to tell him how foolish she'd been, but the words caught in her throat. All she could do was stare, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and gratitude she couldn't begin to express. He looked up, meeting her gaze with a weary smile. "Told you I'd make it," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Without another word, she reached for his hand, gripping it tightly, feeling the solid warmth of his fingers in her own. It was a silent acknowledgement, a gesture that needed no explanation, one that bridged the gap between everything they'd been and everything they'd become. As the ship lifted off, she felt a new strength rising within her, a fierce determination that had been born not from duty or obligation but from something far more powerful. The knowledge that she wasn't alone, that she'd found someone who'd shown her a part of herself she hadn't known existed. In that moment, she understood what he'd been trying to teach her, the lesson he'd risked his life to share. It was more than survival, more than loyalty. It was the courage to care, to trust, to give of oneself without reservation. And as they soared into the vastness of space, leaving the wreckage of her captivity behind, she felt a quiet resolve settle within her. The world she'd known, the beliefs she'd held onto so tightly, they were still there, but now they were tempered by something greater, something deeper. She'd seen the strength of humanity, the resilience that had carried him through countless trials, and in doing so, she'd found a part of herself she hadn't realized was missing. He leaned back, eyes half closed, a look of contentment on his face as the stars stretched out before them. She knew, in that quiet, profound moment, that this journey had changed her forever, that she could no longer see the universe through the narrow lens of her people's values. She'd glimpsed something vast, something precious, and it was a gift she would carry with her, a reminder that in the end, survival meant nothing without the courage to live fully, to connect, to be vulnerable. As they sailed into the unknown, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a new purpose forming in the quiet depths of her mind. She would return to her people, but not as the princess they had once known. She would return as someone who understood the value of strength and kindness, of loyalty and sacrifice, not because it was expected, but because it was right. And with him beside her, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with a spirit renewed, a heart emboldened by the courage of a human who'd taught her what it truly meant to be alive.